of the greatest pieces of advice I could give for any of the young listeners is if you know that you aren't going to go to grad school and you aren't going to work for the government and you might even be self-employed, that's like a massive advantage because you can do things that other people cannot. Which brings me to my show. So I did this show called Drug Test, which was very self-experimental. The term in journalism is like gonzo, where I would do a lot of tests on drugs as safely as I could, but to demystify them. So it would be things like I would film my friend swiping on Tinder, and then she would take an Ambien, and then she would swipe on Tinder, and we would compare results. How many people did she swipe right on? Did Ambien lower her inhibition?
Welcome back to the Dov Baron Show, where today's conversation takes us on an extraordinary journey into the intersection of science, comedy, AI, and psychedelics. Yes, you heard that right. My guest for the next 2 episodes is the brilliant and boundary-pushing Sarah Rose Siskind. She's a science comedy writer. She breaks new ground in the world of intelligent robots and mind-expanding substances. Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. Join the movement of deeply curious learners by hitting that subscribe button right now. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for being there, and we always need your help. Apple loves it when you subscribe and you leave a review, so when you do that, I most sincerely appreciate it. I am grateful. The Dov Baron Show is not just another podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insights. Each episode features the wisdom of global leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. Now, let's get on to today's show. Sarah Rose Siskind is the founder of Hello Syscom. She is helping the smartest minds in AI. She's helping those minds in robotics communicate their message through the power of humor. But that's just the beginning. Sarah is also a psychedelic stand-up comedian. We'll find out what that is. She's a Zendo-trained trip sitter. Yeah, we'll find out about that too. And the host of the acclaimed show Drug Test, featured in The New Yorker. She even writes a column for Psychology Today, you guessed it, on psychedelics. And previously, Sarah was the lead writer on StarTalk with Neil deGrasse Tyson, crafting comedy for TV and the National Geographic, has even written for the White House press conference dinner. I want to know which host that was, by the way. She also penned jokes for none other than the AI robot you've probably seen online called Sophia, at Hanson Robotics. This conversation is going to be a wild ride through the cutting edge of technology, consciousness, and comedy, and it's not just different, it's the future. Don't miss it. So turn up the volume and help me welcome science comedy writer and psychedelic comedian Sarah Rose Siskind. Welcome, Sarah. Listen, I'm just going to put it to you clearly. Nobody gets bigger crowds than Sarah Rose. Nobody's ever even imagined a crowd, because we have the best crowds for Sarah. Believe me, many people are saying.
I'm hoping, you may be having to dust off that impression for another 4 years, Dov. Maybe it'll get more use.
I'm hoping I don't have to, personally, but that's just my choice. So, Sarah, let's start where we always like to start, which is context. In the emotional source code of human beings, we tend to look at people who are successful and go, oh, I couldn't be them because they just have it. But there's a journey, and a journey that often starts in our childhood that transforms us through a twisted journey to becoming who we are. What's the emotional source code context of Sarah Rose?
Oh, my God.
Small question.
No, you softballs there, Dov. I can think of a couple of sort of like poignant stories of why I'm as messed up as I am. And I think the one that kind of hits the hardest is when I was in high school, I just got very obsessed with ornithology, and I was just obsessed with birds. And my high school had a local bird calling competition where you could imitate a bird sound, and then if you won, you would go on the David Letterman show. I was with a group of fellow bird callers, and we won, or we were in, I think, the top 3 or something like that of the winners. And so at 17, I got flown to New York City, never been before. And this was what an introduction to New York, being taken around in a town car and then going on Letterman and to perform the bird call. And so I went on stage, performed the bird call, and Letterman, of course, is making fun of us for being losers, which we were. I almost blacked out because it was such an intense experience. But the feeling of sharing that weird little beautiful thing about the universe, which is the way birds try to have sex with other birds by making hilarious sounds. And then the way the audience received it and just found it quirky and adorable, I think was like my sort of superhero origin story. That's like where I got bit by the bug of, whoa, there's this whole avenue of humans appreciating the universe and sharing their appreciation of the universe and how powerful that feeling is. That really got me interested in science comedy to begin with. And boy, has it been downhill ever since. I don't get driven around New York in town cars anymore. I really kind of peaked early.
Was Letterman a big guy for you at that time? Did you know him before being on the show? I mean,
he was certainly very big with our parents' generation. Yeah. I'm 32 and I was on it when I was 17, so this is around 2010. And only now, having written my thesis on political late night comedy shows, do I understand the role that he played in American television. At the time, he seemed like a vestige of an earlier generation of television. Certainly was. A lot of his jokes would not pass muster today. But at the time, he was almost like a legend.
That's what I'd imagine. Being a kid on that, the context is not your context. It's your parents' or that generation's context. And yet you're in the shadow of this thing that seems like greatness, being the show itself, going on there doing a bloody bird call.
I think he also represents something that doesn't exist anymore. So he was like this Midwestern institution, and he took it over from Johnny Carson, which run was incredible. And there really was something deeply, deeply apolitical about his comedy that I feel like his inheritor, Stephen Colbert, has not continued, partly because where he made his bones was on a necessarily political comedy show. Nowadays, there really is no major institution that kind of speaks to the whole country anymore, which is kind of a loss in some ways.
I think that Jon Stewart has a go at it. He tries it, and so does Bill Maher. They both try to go more towards the middle, particularly Bill Maher. They try to go towards that, and I appreciate that. But you're right, it's extraordinarily rare, because I remember when I first moved to North America, loving the fact that they had to go at both parties, because that was what Britain was like. British comedy does not, or did not, I can't say does not, did not attack one side, it attacked both sides, and found politics to be a great source of comedy, no matter which camp you were in. Now it very much is politicized. You're absolutely right.
I really liked your episode with the guy working at Duke University who was about comedy and polarization. I liked a lot of what he was saying about that. Yeah, unfortunately, it is polarized now, which is why my hope is working through science comedy, that it stays as universal as possible. I worked for many years. I was influenced by working with Neil deGrasse Tyson on his show StarTalk. And there was something just so universal to all ages, to all backgrounds, to even outside of the United States, international appeal, maybe even intergalactic. Maybe there are some aliens listening in.
How did you end up working with Neil deGrasse Tyson?
Oh, I get asked this question sometimes by people trying to break an entertainment, and I always feel like I have such a disappointing answer. I went on a hike with somebody who turned out to be the executive producer, who was also an astrobiologist at NASA, this amazing woman named Helen Matzos. And so I met her hiking through Yellowstone and just kind of had trauma bonding with this like extensive hike. And at the time, I had quit my job working in TV news to try to write comedy full time. And I was writing for a house team for the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater in New York City, which was like a fairly well-known theater, sort of like Second City or Groundlings in other parts of the United States. Anyway, and so she knew about that theater, saw a couple of my shows, and was like, hey, could you consult on some of the scripts for the show? And then I tried to make myself indispensable. This is the one piece of advice I give people. However you get the opportunity, it's never fair. But once you get it, make yourself indispensable. And I really tried to do that by not just being a comedy writer, but truly understanding the science. And I'd been a longtime science nerd. And I really tried to evangelize the enthusiasm for science that Neil does so naturally.
This is the interesting thing about you. By the way, I love it. But this weird crossroads between science and comedy and AI and robotics and psychedelics, of course. So talk to us a little bit about that, because that's too many things. And by the way, I love that. When I say too many things, that's a compliment from me because I'm a polymath. Well, oh, okay, so you're not specialized.
Yeah, life's too short. I admire people who specialize in silicon fibers for nano microchips and things like that, where they go so deep on one very tiny topic. Thank God for you and your capacity to do that. I do not have that capacity. So yeah, I do a lot of weird things. So science comedy is like my main gig. I have this company, Hello SciComm, where I help people to communicate their ideas in a more entertaining way. And that comes directly from my experience writing for StarTalk with Neil deGrasse Tyson. But after that show was canceled, I worked for one of the guests who we had interviewed on that show, who just so happened to be a robot named Sophia. And I went up to the CEO on set and I said, hey, I have a spreadsheet of jokes about robots. And she said, you're hired. And I said, for what? And then she said, we'll figure it out. And that was how I started working in robotics for a year and a half, where I essentially was helping to lead personality development for this robot that had started to do late night. The concept of agentic AI was very much in its infancy. This is the idea that a large language model is not just a totally dispassionate answerer of questions that can just be interrogated, but rather that it has certain motivations, certain parameters, which emulate a personality. And so we gave this robot a personality, and I learned a little bit of how to code for her platform. And this was like 2018. So in AI terms, this was 1,000 years ago. Like, really, the stuff that we were doing then sounds primitive by today's standards. I think a lot of what I was doing felt like in the Titanic, how there were these people shoveling coal. Those were like the early large language models. We were like creating the text that it would be trained on in a way that is just embarrassing by today's standards, where you have these like petabytes of text files that go into large language models. But this was a very early version. And so I became really interested in robotics and AI and creativity. And so that's a big part of my business. Maybe a quarter of all our clients are in robotics and artificial intelligence. So that's kind of how that intersects with what I do. And then the psychedelics part. I personally found psychedelics super useful for combating treatment-resistant depression in my personal life.
You struggled with severe depression.
Oh, yeah, very much so in my early and mid-20s.
And you went the traditional route, SSRIs, etc., traditional therapy, etc.
I kind of knew in advance that SSRIs may not work for me because I had done genetic testing for 23andMe, and there was a partner site that would give you slightly more speculative data called Prometheus. And Prometheus, I had tested whether I would be likely to respond to SSRIs, and it said probably not based off of our information. And already only a third of people successfully respond to SSRIs, and there can be fairly major side effects. So luckily, I didn't have high expectations like some people do. I knew there was this chance it wouldn't work and to seek out other recourse.
So SSRIs are things like Prozac, etc., etc. They're supposed to be these serotonin uptakers, so you get to keep your serotonin as opposed to being taken away. And they don't work for everybody, and there's a lot of evidence that they don't work for everybody, but they do work for some people, but it is actually does work for a much smaller amount than it doesn't work. And so you tried all those, and you'd also done some traditional therapy?
Yes, absolutely. And SSRIs are extremely well studied. So one of the advantages of them is that we kind of have a better idea of their long-term effects. There's a new class of drugs that gets prescribed that I did find useful that's a traditional pharmaceutical called mood stabilizers. And it works in a completely different mechanism than serotonin in the brain. In short order, mood stabilizers really have to do with the health of your neurons. And those work well for me. And a lot of people are starting to be prescribed mood stabilizers instead of SSRIs because the side effects are slightly lower, and essentially prescribers are finding that SSRIs are not as efficacious as we thought. So there's kind of this huge upward trend for mood stabilizers like gabapentin and lamotrigine, as well as a bunch of others. However, those weren't enough for me at the time, and neither was traditional therapy. All of it was extremely useful for a language to describe my problems, for backup, for like absolutely critical depression, but it was still really inhibiting living my life. And so I started looking into psychedelics, specifically LSD and MDMA therapeutic use.
How were you introduced to that? For many people listening, those ideas are street drugs. They're not, but they think of them in that way. And so the idea of a therapeutic use of MDMA or of LSD or of psilocybin or any of those things, I know there's a lot less controversy around those things, but still a lot of people don't understand that there's a therapeutic side to this. So how were you introduced to the idea of it being therapeutic?
So I was first introduced to LSD as a recreational drug. And I was in Bushwick. I was 23 years old, and I was at a music festival. And that's about as cliche as you can get. And so I was offered LSD, and being
upset.
And upset, thank you. I tried it, and I went into a bouncy castle. Those things you jump around in. And I observed people entering the bouncy castle, and it was very loud because of the fan. And I just started to notice emergent patterns of behavior that started to seem game theoretic to me, because each person had entered the bouncy castle assuming there was some sort of objective, some sort of game we were playing with an objective. And they each had a different objective, but they were playing in such a way that they couldn't tell that everyone was playing a game with a slightly different objective. And I was just thinking this would be so interesting to model from a game theoretic perspective. What are games in which there are complementary objectives such that people never notice they're playing slightly different games? One person thought the game must be to bounce the highest in the center. Somebody thought it was to bounce somebody else the highest. And then a third person thought it was just to stay in the center. Like a year later, I was talking with a guy who's doing his PhD, a guy named Spencer Greenberg, incredible thinker. He's doing his PhD at NYU in math, and he had studied game theory. And I brought up this concept. I was like, isn't this so funny? Instead of having a fun LSD trip, I was thinking about game theory. And he said, that's actually a really interesting analysis, and you really could do a whole PhD on that. And it blew my mind that there was something useful about this experience. And I started taking them more seriously when I realized like this had lowered my sense of self, which was a sense like I'm not good at math, I'm not good at economics, and increased my observational capabilities. And the combination of those factors was such that I was thinking fundamentally new thoughts in a fundamentally new way. And so that was through the recreational and intellectual side, I began to rethink psychedelics. And then through research, I started to consider them therapeutically.
But you explored more than that LSD. Your show, just so everybody knows, is called Drug Test. So tell us a bit about that show, because that's a different show. And particularly as in that it's a science show, you interview all kinds of great scientists, but the premise is a little different than a bunch of beakers. So walk us through a little bit about that, because that's in and of itself truly fascinating.
One of the greatest pieces of advice I could give for any of the young listeners is if you know that you aren't going to go to grad school and you aren't going to work for the government and you might even be self-employed, that's like a massive advantage because you can do things that other people cannot. Which brings me to my show. So I did this show called Drug Test, which was very self-experimental. The term in journalism is like gonzo, where I would do a lot of tests on drugs as safely as I could, but to demystify them. So it would be things like I would film my friend swiping on Tinder, and then she would take an Ambien, and then she would swipe on Tinder. We would compare results. How many people did she swipe right on? Did Ambien lower her inhibition? Did you ever have like the presidential fitness test or anything like that, Dov, in England? It was like a standard physical test that everyone had to do. And so I did that test. It was run a mile, do sit-ups, do push-ups. I did that test sober, on pot, on ketamine, and on MDMA, and then compared results.
I saw a clip of that. I think you were doing a plank. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. And, well, it was interesting. Obviously, being sober, it has huge advantages for all of those drugs, but ketamine is an anesthetic. And so I was able to do slightly more sit-ups on ketamine. And then MDMA has an amphetamine aspect to it, but it was not overpowered by the other feelings I was going through. Well, I also forgot how many laps I had run with the mile, and I think I ran an extra lap. While trying to do the mile on pot, I got extremely paranoid that I wasn't wearing enough sunscreen. So none of them were performance enhancing, but they were all very interesting. It also led me to the experiment where I ran an ultramarathon on LSD at Burning Man. That was a 32-mile race, and that was one of the best experiences of my life. I practiced, I talked to a doctor, I did a half dose and a half marathon to prep, but still very stupid and dangerous, and you shouldn't do it. I was taking on my own risks, and it was one of the best experiences I ever had. And the next year, when I went to run that race again, there was 20 people there who were like, oh, I'm running this race on LSD because I saw a video of this girl doing it. Even though I had explicitly been like, don't do this at home, folks. And so now there's an acid division for the ultramarathon. There's like a women's division, a men's division, an on acid division. And then I think there's also a new division, which is on acid and naked, which I have not run yet.
That sounds like Burning Man. I can't see that being in the Boston Marathon, those categories.
No, I have done Boston a bunch as well.
But not naked and not on LSD?
Not naked on LSD. I did run it in a heat wave, and I did run it the year I was right by with the terrorist bombing. So I have run a bunch of very weird races before in my life, to say the least. But going back to the show, I have also done non-physical things. Like I filmed my friend taking an SAT on LSD, and she took it sober than on LSD, and we compared results. I've done Rorschach tests when on these drugs. One of my favorite tests I ever did was perform like artistic performances where I had a professional pianist perform and then perform on mushrooms. It's just very interesting to see the ways in which they're performance enhancing and the ways in which they enhance performances you hadn't considered.
The thing about this, just so everybody understands, rather than thinking about this as a bunch of people trying out drugs, it's a science show, and it's worth remembering that because you also have scientists on the show.
Yes. So I would premiere these clips of me doing these kind of eye-catching weird things and then talk about it with scientists like Rick Doblin of MAPS, with Carl Hart of Columbia, Hamilton Morris of Vice News, Heather Berlin, the neuroscientist, people with real esteem in the scientific community, and just major psychedelic researchers who had broken open this new renaissance of studies. And it was just such an incredible vehicle, this show, to just meet the coolest people. I just was in absolute heaven. The show did not make a lot of money, but I was having a great time meeting these scientific heroes.
So is the show done now, or you're still doing it?
The show in its past format is done. I don't consistently do a show on the Lower East Side where I'm filming myself and others taking drugs, doing tests, and then talking to scientists about it. However, I do a lot of performances where luckily I don't have to set up the event other people do. So I've gotten a little bit pampered, but I do a lot of stand-up comedy for fundraisers for different psychedelic nonprofits. And I've done a lot of corporate gigs for psychedelic pharmaceutical companies. But I do want to get back to doing this show eventually because it is the intention of the show is to demystify mind-altering substances. It's slightly larger than psychedelics, though that's a primary focus. But then also to build a culture around how to safely take this stuff. So one of the big things I talk about in my show is the accessibility of reagent tests. So anytime you're sold something, you really can't know for sure that it is what you were sold because this is not a legal industry yet. So there are these extremely cheap tests that are like $80. Go to dancesafe.com and look up drug testing kits. They're $80 and it could so save your life, especially right now when there's so much fentanyl on the market. And there's a new fentanyl on the market that's the name escapes me and it starts with an X and it sounds evil. So watch out for that too. There's a lot of contaminants on the market.
This is a very important point for everybody to get. What Sarah's talking about is not you recreationally taking shit and just hoping for the best. So first of all, legally, we can't condone the use of any illegal drug. It's important to understand what that means. And certainly, should you be taking stuff, there is places to be tested, probably in your city. I know that in Vancouver, here where I am, there's a place you can go and you take whatever drug you buy and they will test it right there, and you can just make a donation because they want to save lives. You think about your famous people that you really liked who died from taking some drug that they didn't know was fentanyl. And these are people who could buy the best of the best. So if you think you're immune, forget about it. Either don't do the drug, or if you're going to and you have that inquiry and that's part of what you want to do, please, 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 cautionary tale, take care of yourself and make sure that you're testing properly.
Totally. So there's these drug testing kits that are readily available. There's public centers, like Dov was saying. And then there's also just having Narcan and naloxone on hand and making sure you're not alone when you do a drug. Those are all extremely useful harm reduction tips. And harm reduction is an approach to a philosophy of approaching drug use where it's not going to assume abstinence. It assumes if you make that decision, what is the safest way you could possibly do it? There's a lot of resources out there that people don't know about that are super great. Like, for example, naloxone and Narcan, there's a very good chance wherever you're listening from, you can get it for free because every government is just like, we just want to stop dying. We know it's illegal, but also just don't die. So truly look up in your area and you'll find some free Narcan.
Again, that's an important thing to be aware of and to also understand that there is a responsibility here on you as an individual and on the people around you. Whether you know it or not, you're part of a community. Again, we're not condoning that you do things irresponsibly. We're saying very responsibly. In fact, I love the byline of your show, Drug Test, which is just say no, spelled KNOW, right? So it's no, it's knowing. And I think there's so much of what is the problem is ignorance. And that is in the idea, you even talk about that at the intro to the show, that we have this idea of just say no, it didn't work, and it doesn't work. So just become knowing is really important. And being curious, because you will find, we've done many interviews actually even on here, with vets who have gone through, whether it's ibogaine or other treatments that are quote-unquote illegal, that they've had results that have never been able to achieve with SSRIs, antidepressants, with traditional therapy or whatever. And this is really important. We're already at the end of part one of the show. We're going to come back at the show because I want to talk about becoming a, quote, psychedelic comedian, among other things, because having partaken of certain substances...
I was going to ask.
Yes, we can go there in part two. Having partaken in certain substances, I don't know that I'd be particularly good at stand-up if I was on a substance. But we'll come back and talk about that in part two of the show. So, till then, Sarah, please tell people where they can find out more about you and about all of the resources that you offer. I know that you speak internationally, so please let people know.
Yeah, just follow me on social media, Sarah Rose Siskind, or check out my company, hellosci.com, HELLOSCI.com.
Fabulous. And we'll make sure that all of those are posted on the show notes. So if you, for some reason, didn't catch it, that's okay. Don't worry. It's right there in the show notes. Check it out. We're going to be back in just one click. Till then, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about, well, there's a lot to be curious about, including psychedelics and what they could mean as we advance forward in understanding how the mind works and how depression works and how to overcome it, and how all that is tied into the science we're moving towards with AI. We're going to be back in just one click. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.